Oh, right. So I don't know if I went over this last time, but this is kind of again the way psychologists see or investigate phenomenon today dealing with the mind. Okay, and it's called the biopsychosocial model. And all three of these we know from the theories we've already reviewed. All of these play a role in our behavior and mental processes. Okay, and so we'll start actually right here with biology. Biological factors not only include what parts of the nervous system are associated with behavior and mental processes, and what happens if those areas get damaged or stimulated in some way, but it also includes things like what part of your behavior is genetically determined. So what parts of, for example, I read an article on loneliness this weekend that was talking about what portion of your genetics determines how much social connection you need. And then how much is determined by the environment and the social interactions with parents and those kinds of things. And they use what we call a genetic quotient. So it usually comes from twin studies of identical twins and that were separated at birth. And we look at how similar their behaviors are with each other. Because identical twins are called identical because their genetic codes are exactly the same. So the assumption is if they were separated at birth, any similarities you see between them are probably due to their similar genetic code, not due to their environmental experiences. Okay. According to this study, about 48% of your need to have friends and socially connect with someone else is determined by your genetic code. Okay. And then 52% is determined by your experience. Okay. And so that's an example of wanting to know how much of behavior is determined by your biology and what you're born with versus how much was determined by your environment. Okay. And then we have these two determinants. Okay. Social, when we talk about the social world, we want to know how much of your behavior and mental processes were determined by the situation that you were in, determined by the people who were around you, determined about the type of parenting you had and the teachers you had. How much of your world or the reasons you behave the way you do is due to that factor. Okay. And as we'll see, when we get to the developmental factor section, it's not always because of the way you were parented as a kid that determines how you'll be as an adult, as a lot of assumptions have been made, that you go through different life cycles and social interactions throughout your lifetime that really determine what your outcome is. So in early childhood, yes, it's the family situation, but then when you get into adolescence, peers tend to have more of an influence on your behavior and mental processes than family. And so we'll talk about that as we move along. But also when we get to social psychology, we'll see that the situation has a huge determinant upon how we behave and how we act. Okay. And then we want to look at the psychological aspects of behavior. So we want to know how much is contributed by your biology and by your nervous system reactions, those types of things. But then we want to know, the situation, what the situation brings into it. But then we want to know, memories, for example, emotions, as an example, ideas that you have about the world. What is your ideology? What are those internal processes when you're thinking about behaving or acting in a certain way are determined by those thought processes. Okay? So, and combined all together is what we call the biopsychosocial model, which is really, we find determines the causal links of human behavior. Okay? And when we get to the abnormal section, we'll see that probably one of the best models of treatment we have is one that includes biological aspects, health, well-being, medication, but also therapy type of modalities, getting thoughts and the processes. And then who are you in your world? But how do you determine your social relationships? And we can get to that section. We'll even see within clinical psychology, this model is the most popular model as far as treatment efficacy. Okay. And I just mentioned probably one of the bigger influences in the field of psychology that has occurred over the last 30 years is really something called cultural psychology. Okay. And what cultural psychology attempts to do is recognition, just what this says, recognition that culture has a large influence on an individual's behaviors and mental processes. And that's something that hasn't been appreciated in the field for a long time. Normally, psychology looks for big principles. So when we try to do cross-cultural studies, what we were just trying to prove is a universality of some given law or some given theory, instead of looking at what was the unique contribution of that given culture to that person's behavior and mental processes. And we'll see a lot when we get into cultural psychology. Probably the biggest influence on overall culture is whether you come from what's considered a collective or interdependent culture, or an individualistic or an intra-dependent culture. And the biggest difference between those is how you define yourself and your success and failures. So if you define yourself as a member of a group, and what's important is that membership to that group and what you contribute to the group, you're more collective. If, on the other hand, your successes and your failures are all yours, and you don't make consideration for anyone else but yourself for your successes and your failures, you're more independent or intra-dependent. Okay? And we will see that it holds true. The United States and England measure overall largely individualistic, whereas when we get more into Eastern cultures and those kinds of things, they're more collective. But what we will see when we get to these sections is that even here in the United States, there can be a lot more diversity. Okay. So what we find, for example, with a lot of Native American communities, they tend to be more collective than individualistic. But that's again determined upon how westernized that community has become. We find that newer states here in the United States, so states like Utah, who were admitted into the United States at a later date, tend to be more individualistic, whereas older states that were part, like for example, the original 13 colonies, tend to be more collective. So it seems like the newness of a state creates individualism here in the United States. So, but we'll talk more about that and why that's important to recognize when we're dealing with behavior, because when we see people in a collective community fail, it's not that they felt their community, they felt their parents, they felt their family. Or in an individualistic community, when someone fails, it was because of me, irregardless of my family, and that stuff doesn't matter. Okay? And we'll look at the consequences of those two attitudes. And as I mentioned, one of the things that you'll be exploring is what's called indigenous psychology. It's aka Native American psychology, or what's called post-colonial psychology. And in this, it's the recognition that many indigenous people live in a dual life. One is with the Western impositions and indigenous ways of being, and constantly walking that line between each two. And this movement emphasizes decolonization thought. So taking away from, there's a place for measurement, but not everything needs to be measured is kind of the idea. Recognizing that individual experience and context matters. and understanding how historical issues impact current behavior and mental processes. A good example of this is when we do get to the abnormal section, we will talk about trauma. And everybody has probably heard the term historical trauma that you get from past experiences from the place you come from. And we'll see that that actually does have a huge influence on our behaviors today. In fact, an article that came out in 2018 has actually found genetically where trauma exists in your genetic code from past experiences. And we'll talk about a term called the collective unconscious when we get to that section, that there is actually part of your genes that has taken on the trauma and the experience of your ancestors up to today. And has influences on behavior. So we'll talk about how that's important when we get to those sections. Right. So that's again talking about culture, and because it really didn't fit in the biopsychosocial model, you can see that it does have a huge implications on our behaviors. I want to talk now just briefly about different opportunities within the field of psychology. So first, let's define what a psychologist is. This is usually a master or doctoral degree trained person. And specifically, the training is in method, statistics, and theory. Okay? For example, in my doctoral coursework, it was 90 credits, and 70 of those credits was in research methodology, the scientific method, and statistics. And that's same regardless of whether you're going to become a research psychologist or a clinical or practice psychologist. Okay. The majority of the field does do treatment and therapy. I think I mentioned in here, for example, with the American Psychology Association, about 52% of psychologists identify themselves as clinical or counseling psychologists. And so they're individuals who do assessment and treatment of different mental disorders and dysfunctions. I do want to real quickly differentiate between a clinical psychologist or a psychologist and a psychiatrist. Okay? A psychiatrist is someone who goes to medical school, and then after medical school, they specialize in mental disorders. So they specialize for about 2 years in mental disorders, which gives them the ability to do like medication treatment and those kind of things. A clinical psychologist is someone who's trained completely through their graduate school, specifically in disorders and dysfunction, and they end up with a PhD, which is a doctorate in philosophy, or a PsyD, which is a doctorate in psychology. Okay. But I always, psychiatrists and psychologists get kind of confused with each other in our popular culture. Okay. But as been mentioned, not all psychologists perform therapy. There's actually in the American Psychology, there's actually 52 different divisions of psychology. This just represents some of the major ones. And so we have, for example, experimental psychologists. These are individuals who just do experiments on general behavior and mental processes that cover everyone, not necessarily just clinical populations. I myself, my doctorate is in social psychology, so I study the influence of individuals on behavior, individuals in groups on individual behaviors and individual influence groups. There's even political psychologists. These are individuals who study politics and often I know that well, I think the last one was Obama, George Bush Jr., Clinton, and who they ran against, going back to about 1980, except for the recent elections since 2016. A lot of those presidential candidates hired political psychologists while they were campaigning to give the right voice, how should I give the speech, how should I speak? How should I introduce myself? And that's what a lot of political psychologists do. Industrial organizational psychologist, this is my master's degree. Now, if you want to make bank in psychology, so you're like, I'm really interested in this, but I want to make a living. IO psychology might be of interest to you, okay? Because an IO psychologist works with organizations to increase their performance. And for example, one of my colleagues works for the MGM Grand in Las Vegas. Yeah. And last time I visited him, this was like 10 years ago, he was doing an experiment. What the casino was frustrated with is that people ended up lingering in the hallways instead of going to the casino. So he was doing an experiment by, you know how in a mall they have those walls that come out that says coming soon? Well, he was putting up fake walls that would shorten and then expand the hallway, shorten and expand the hallway to see if that kind of fluctuation in a hallway will get people to stop lingering in the hallways and kind of push them towards the casino. And the casinos make a great experiment because the air conditioning, lighting, everything is controlled by the casino, even time. And so that's what he does. And like I said, most IO psychologists, if you do a really good program that has a good internship program, usually are making 6 figures within the first few years. My friend was making over $750,000 a year in 2 years out of his degree. So it's kind of a more lucrative field to get into psychology. And then these different ones, cognitive psychology, of course, looks at the brain, behavior, personality, neuroscience. There was a mention about forensic psychology. Forensic psychology is actually a fairly new field within the field of psychology. And interestingly, the reason I caution people about going into forensic psychology is there's not actually a job waiting for you when you get out of forensic psychology programs. But forensic psychology looks at the behaviors and mental processes that lead to crimes. Most forensic psychologists usually go in order to get into federal law enforcement, those types of things, investigation and those types of areas within the criminal justice field. But I will tell you, most of the forensic psychologists I know, their bread and butter is doing divorce and custody hearing evaluations and those kinds of things. So it's kind of one of those fields that is developing, but it really hasn't found its place for an actual career yet. And have to niche your way into it. But it is a very interesting field as far as what they're studying, studies the criminal mind and those things. Okay, so what about the job market itself? Okay, for non-clinical, such as research psychologists and those individuals, the field is pretty good. So if you want to go into example, quantitative neuroscience, social and personality psychology, these are growing, okay? And quantitative and neuroscience, these are growing because of the technology areas of the world. As we're learning how to mass information and quantify information, quantitative methods is becoming important. Neuroscience, understanding how the brain influences our behavior. And a lot of organizations right now are hiring social and personality psychologists because of their kind of this post-pandemic weirdness we're in, about how do we start to integrate socially again and do all of those kinds of things. The non-clinical field, non-academic field, such as IO psychology, is probably the big field right now, and also high earning. In the clinical field and counseling and those types of things, one of the things that you should be aware of is even though there is a huge need for mental health services, I mean, it exceeds most communities' capacities. There's not a lot of organizations that want to invest in it. Okay, so the unfortunate part about this is it's a much needed field, but it's highly competitive, especially when you get to doctoral level work. It's a very highly competitive field, and there's always a job somewhere, but it's always determined on what you're willing to settle for after you go and get your master's or doctorate degree. So, if I were to make a recommendation for anyone who wants to go into the clinical field or counseling field, it would be aimed towards making your own practice. Because that seems to be what a lot of the individuals don't rely on organizations to work with. Try to work towards being an independent practitioner with your own practice. So, but that is the job market. Oh, and then these are some other options. So a lot of these individuals tend to, for example, get their bachelor's in psychology or social work, but these are some different ones. The psychoanalysts are kind of the post-Freudian individuals. Usually they're kind of East Coast, some Latin countries still do psychoanalysis. Counselors are usually a person with a master's degree, and they go and get their LPC, which is a licensed practical counselor. Some go into the addiction field and get their addiction counseling degrees, but this allows you to do things like marriage, school, things dealing with moderate levels of mental illness like depression, anxiety, those kind of things. A psychiatric social worker is someone who has a master's degree in social work and applies more of the social sciences to different type of clinical or hospitalized individuals. And then there's also psychiatric nurses. This is an RN with additional training. This is usually a registered nurse who goes in and does medication management for inpatient places at hospitals, those kinds of things. And then there's the paraprofessionals, those who work, for example, here in the state of Arizona, you can go be, I know it's not called this anymore, and I can't remember the correct term, but a child protection person. You can do that with a bachelor's of psychology in Arizona. You can do group work. You can do work in youth homes, all those kind of different paraprofessional areas. You can do with that at the bachelor level of psychology, at least here in Arizona. It really determines upon what state you live in, that determines degree level. And so those. Okay, let's stop sharing. I told you today was going to be short.